Yep.
Yep.
And it looks like we have a couple people waiting on us, so I will go ahead and admit.
All right. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you here today that have taken some time to join us for our 5th installment of the Adventures in Field Research virtual seminar series. We are pleased to have Dr. Justin Wright joining us today from Duke University, and he's going to give us a presentation he calls From the Arctic to the Tropics, from the Desert to the Wetlands, Disturbance is Everywhere. Lessons from a Globe-Trotting Ecologist. And before I turn it over to Dr. Wright, I want to remind everyone that your mics are muted when you enter. There will be a question period, an answer period at the end of the talk so that we can have some nice discussion. At that time, you're welcome to unmute your mic. In the meantime, if you're afraid you'll forget your question, take advantage of that chat box in the bottom, type your question in, and we'll make sure it gets addressed during that question answer discussion period. So with that, welcome everyone, and we'll turn it over to Dr. Wright.
Great, thank you very much. Let me get my screen going. Okay, does that look good? Okay, great. So I really appreciate you guys showing up today, and I just wanted to take some time to tell you some stories that is both about the science and also about how we do the science from my career. As I say in the title, I've been lucky to get to go all over the place. It's one of the great joys of being an ecologist is that there are so many fascinating systems to study. I've got a couple of pictures here. On the left here, this is a picture up in the Arctic. You're looking south to the Brooks Range, so we're all the way far up on the northern slope. And this was work of one of my PhD students who was studying the effect of global warming on spiders and how spiders change. Well, basically, as spiders get warmer, they get hungrier. And so trying to figure out what the impacts of hungrier spiders is. Won't spend much time talking about that, but since I put Arctic in the title, I thought I would put that slide. And then over here on the right is a picture that I took. This was while I was a graduate student. I was lucky enough to spend a little bit of time in Israel studying the plants in the desert. And I just love this picture because what you're seeing here is just the desert floor in this part of the Negev Desert in Israel is covered with this crust that is hydrophobic. So water, it doesn't rain much because it's a desert, but when water does rain there, it hits the surface and just runs right off in a sheet because there's all these bacteria living on the soil that basically make up a crust. They create almost like a waxy, sugary crust. And this was a place where we had done some field work, and one of the things you always do when you do field work, you have to mark out where you are, and we use these little things called pin flags, which are you can imagine if you had a wire hanger and you straightened it out. So you have a wire like that with a flag on the end, and we poke it in to mark where our crust is. And someone a couple of years ago had put a pin in this area, and then they'd removed it, and so there was this little tiny hole in the crust, and that was enough that was a place where the water was able to go in, and you have this little tulip like plant that was able to grow right out of that little hole. So this is a case of disturbance, and I'll get into exactly what I mean by disturbance later. Just tiny little disturbance, just a little prick in the soil leading to this beautiful flower right in the middle of practically nowhere. So I just love that image as sort of the importance of even little tiny changes to ecological systems can have impacts. So that's the desert and the Arctic. I won't talk too much about the tropics. I've done some fascinating work there, working in streams, but mostly we'll be talking about a couple of sort of stories from my career where I've done work in different systems, but all looking at different aspects of disturbance. So what is disturbance? The short answer is that there is no short answer to that. It's a thing that we all sort of have an idea of disturbance. Oh yeah, you have a system and you poke it and that's a disturbance. But it's actually kind of hard to come up with a good scientific definition of it. But one of the ones that I like was written by Stuart Pickett and Peter White in a book, where they said it's a relatively discrete event in time. So it's discrete. It happens that disrupts ecosystems, communities, or population structure, changes resource, substrate availability, or the physical environment. So it's some sort of a change from the way the system was. And so it happens all the time in lots of different ways. And the question is, why is this an interesting question for ecologists to be asking? Well, as I said, it's pervasive. You pretty much can't find an ecosystem that doesn't experience some forms of disturbance. And because of that, it's one of the key things that sort of sets the stage on which organisms evolve. And we can think of organisms being adapted to sort of the dominant disturbance regime. So just as a sort of example of this isn't work of my own, but it's a great example of this. We often think of fire as a disturbance, right? But fire happens in very different ways. And the ways in which fire happens is both a function of who is living there and also shapes the way that organisms live there. So over here on the left, this is a picture that was in the National Geographic. This was the Yellowstone Fire. So 1988, if you happen to remember or have heard stories, or you can look it up, all of Yellowstone National Park was on fire, just huge explosive fires. And at the time, it was sort of viewed as a catastrophe. And then sort of over time, we've kind of thought about it more. And so this guy actually took this picture back in 1988, and this is 10 years later. And you can see behind him, the forest is coming back, right? So this is one kind of forest out in Yellowstone National Park. This is a picture that I took just down south of where I work at Duke. So this is in the Sandhills region of North Carolina. This is a forest too, but you can see that this is a very different forest. So here the forest is exploding into the sky, burning down all the trees, kills everything. We call that a stand replacing fire. And here the fire just kind of creeps along the ground, burns stuff on the ground, but the trees are largely untouched, right? And so that's a very different fire, and it's both because of and shapes that. So these are both systems that are dominated by pine trees. But over in Yellowstone, you have what's called the Lodgepole Pine. And in North Carolina, we have the Longleaf Pine. And I've just got some pictures of the two of them here. So on the left, you can see the Longleaf Pine. One of the things you might notice is it has branches that go all the way down to the ground. So any little fire that's creeping on the ground is going to catch those branches on fire and whoosh, go right up to the top of the canopy. Whereas the Longleaf Pine, you can see it has this long, whoops, sorry about that, long trunk that just doesn't have any branches on it. So that keeps the fire from going up into the canopy. Another really interesting difference is if you look at how they recruit. So the Longleaf Pine has what we call serotoninous cones. Their cones are basically glued shut. And to release their seeds, that glue needs to be removed. And the way that it does that is it gets burned, and that fire melts the glue and releases the seeds out into the environment. So without fire, this species can't actually reproduce. The longleaf pine, on the other hand, has a very different way of dealing with fire. So this is a baby longleaf pine tree. It looks a lot like grass. In fact, they call it a grass stage. And what happens is it just sort of sits there, it burns, and a little fire comes by and burns it. It doesn't really care. It just kind of grows back, but it doesn't even try to become a tree until it's burned for a couple of years. All of that time, it's putting resources down below ground, and its roots are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And then once it has enough resources, it shoots up and gets tall enough that it can escape the fire. So this longleaf pine tree is a species that's adapted to living in a system where you have these high frequency fires. They happen every 3, 4, 5 years, and low intensity. The fires aren't all that hot. They don't burn up the entire canopy. And so that's sort of shaped the environment and shaped the tree. The lodgepole pine out west has a totally different strategy. Fires come by every 50, 60, 100 years. And when they do come by, they're big and they burn everything. And that is the sort of system that it's adapted to. So that's just a great example of how just one kind of disturbance, fire, can show up in very different ways in different systems, and has also shaped the kinds of life that we see in them. So it's just sort of, I think it's a great example of disturbance being everywhere, but being different everywhere you look. And it's really important for ecologists to try to understand what it is. We can't understand patterns of diversity without the context of disturbance, and we can't understand basically ecological systems without disturbance. And importantly, that context of disturbance is changing right now. So let me just give you a couple of quick examples. So here, this is a picture of the Cape Town drought from about 2 years ago, flooding in San Antonio a couple of years ago. This is a picture from the 2020 hurricane season. This was a record number of named storms all at the same time. And then this is a picture of the fires out in California. So these are all examples of the way that global climate change can really change disturbance. And so you might have a system where for hundreds of years, there's been a certain disturbance regime. They experience drought, you know, the deserts experience drought, but they might only experience it every 5 years, or it might only last for a couple of months. And now it's happening every year, or it's lasting for a full year. Flooding, lots of systems flood. It's not, that's disturbance and that's natural, but if it's increasing in frequency, that's changing the system, the way that the system is working, and that changes the situation that species are adapted to. Lots of hurricanes, again, hurricanes in this part of North Carolina, we're used to hurricanes, right? They happen, they're a disturbance regime and species are adapted to it. But if you keep getting whacked or the hurricanes get bigger and bigger, that's a different thing. Same with fires in California. California is a system that burns, but it doesn't burn like this. And so it's hotter and more frequent. And so this disturbance regime is constantly changing. And so that's why it's really important for ecologists to understand disturbance and what are the factors that make disturbance change a system. And so we can think about disturbance. I like to draw pictures to think about disturbance. And so here we've just got a generic graph. We've got time on the x-axis, so time is chugging along. And I've got state variable here. That's just a way of saying, and we're measuring something. It could be anything you're interested in, okay? And actually, as the talk goes on, I'll talk about different state variables. But you know, we're humming along at a certain level. That might be the number of species in the system, might be the amount of carbon in the system, but it's just humming along, and then we get a disturbance, right? So the first thing we want to know is just how big that disturbance is, right? It might be it might cause a small change in the state variable, or it might cause a big change in the state variable. Right? So that's one aspect of disturbance that might be important, right? Obviously, a big magnitude of disturbance is going to have more of an effect. We could also look at how long it takes for the system to bounce back. What is the recovery time, right? And if you bounce back quickly from a disturbance, all else being equal, that disturbance is going to have less of an impact. And then finally, we can look at the frequency. So how often is this disturbance happening? So all three of these things, the magnitude, the length of time it takes to recover, and the frequency with which disturbance is happening are key features for understanding, is disturbance going to be a big factor in this system, okay? So what I'm going to do is talk about sort of 3 stories from my career that talk first about the magnitude of disturbance, second, the recovery time of disturbance, and finally, the frequency of disturbance. So let's get started. So magnitude, and here in this part of the talk, mostly what I'm going to be focusing on is the number of species in an area. So magnitude is a function of 2 things. You might just think it's just how big the disturbance is, right? You might think, well, a small windstorm has a bit smaller magnitude than a hurricane, right? But it also really importantly depends on who's already living there and who can respond to that. So if you have a species pool that has species that can respond to a disturbance, you're going to see a bigger change. And so I'm going to explain what I mean by that, and I'm really going to focus on that in this story. And this comes from early in my career when I was a PhD student, and I was working up in upstate New York. And this is a picture that I took from a plane. And what you're seeing here is a landscape that is largely forest, right? But we have some streams. You can kind of see where the stream is going through here that's flowing through the forest. And then we have these big patches here and another one right here. Those are pretty striking features of the landscape, right? And those are due to beaver. And I was really interested in the question of what are beaver doing in this landscape. And so in particular, I was interested in the plant species that we find here. So this is an active beaver pond. You can actually see the dam right here, and beaver are swimming around in here. There aren't many plant species growing in there, at least not the ones that I was interested in. There's probably algae and stuff. But what happens after a period of time, and it varies depending on a number of factors, the beaver will leave that site. And when they do leave that site, the dam collapses, and you get these, and then the pond rapidly fills in, and it gets colonized by a bunch of plant species, and you get these big wetlands forming. And if you go on the ground, this is what they look like. They're really beautiful areas, full of grasses and sedges. Sometimes you get these alders growing up here, and very different from the forest all around it. And I was quite curious, talking about the species pool and who can respond, is this just the same species that you find in the forest, but just growing in a different environment, or are there different sets of species that respond to this disturbance? And I had good reason to think that they'd be different. So this is a picture of a beautiful stream up in the Adirondacks, and you can see that it's shady here as opposed to sunny in the meadow. There's not much soil here, whereas in the meadow, those soils can be up to a yard deep, so really rich soils. So it's a pretty different environment. The magnitude of change of the environment is big, but how about the magnitude of who's there? So I spent a lot of time wandering through these meadows, first wandering and then very conscientiously sampling them. And so I would go and I would count the number of species in a bunch of different meadows, and then also wander up and down these streams and sample the vegetation here and basically identify all the species. I spent a lot of time learning how to identify grasses, which is quite a tricky thing. They don't have big showy flowers that you can use to identify them. So that took a lot of time. So a lot of skill in identifying the species, but eventually I was able to come up with an answer. And I can show you that here. This is a graphical way of looking at this. This is a weird graph where I have labeled the axes, but they're just labeled axis 1 and axis 2. And that's because they're crunching a whole bunch of data together. But what this is each of these points here, it's a little blurry, I apologize for that, but these are triangles down here, and these are X marks and squares down here. Each of those represents one of the plots that I put down there. I measured all of my species in half-meter squared plots. And what it is condensing all this information is saying, how similar is one plot to another plot in terms of which species are there? So these 2 points up here are very close together in this graph. So that means that the species in them is almost the same. One might have species A, B, and C. The other one might have A, B, and D, right? So pretty much the same species there. Whereas this point up here and this point up here, down here, are very far apart on this graph, which means they have very different species in them. So this first one might have A, B, and C, and the other one has X, Y, and Z. And the shape of these tells you whether they were from a forest or from a meadow. And so all of these ones up here are forest plots, and these ones down here are meadow plots. So they're separated in space, which tells us we've got a totally different set of species in each of these habitats. So this disturbance is having a big magnitude, both because it's changing the environment a lot, but also because there are species in the landscape that are there that can capitalize on those differences. And so the first thing I did is, well, I was like, let's play a little thought experiment. Let's imagine a landscape that didn't have any beaver in it. And how many plant species would we see in that landscape? And I was able to estimate that we'd see somewhere around 60. And then I said, well, let's do another thought experiment where we had beaver going crazy and we're everywhere on the landscape. How many species would we see in that landscape where there was no more forest left? And there'd be a few more species. But if I compare that to the number of species we actually see in the landscape, which has a mix of both beaver and forest in it, we see the most species there. And so that's telling me that the beaver are really important because they are a disturbance that is creating a large magnitude disturbance where there are lots of species that are different. So that was the fieldwork component of it. And one of the great things about fieldwork is that it always leaves you with more questions than you started with. And sometimes you can answer those questions by doing more experiments. But sometimes the questions you have require you to just think about things conceptually. And so just to give you a flavor of that, what I did next was develop a mathematical model for this system. And so mathematical models are just a way of abstracting the system, okay? And so what we've got here is, here's that picture. And what I did is I said, well, there's a couple of different types of patches in this landscape. So first we've got these forested streams, right? That's one type of patch in the landscape. Then we have these active ponds, that's another type. And we know that if a patch is in forest, it moves into that active state because beaver come and build a dam, right? And then over time, those active ponds drain and become either young ponds, and then over time they become old ponds, and they could be recolonized and become active again, or they could, the trees could keep growing and they could go back to forest. So we've got active ponds, we've got these P and D, which are basically the types of beaver meadows that I'm talking about, and then forested areas. I've left this in yellow, which is hard to see. If you're really interested, you can dig into the equations to describe this. But you know, they're basically sentences. They say that the number of the change in active patches is just a number of how many beaver are going out in the landscape and finding new patches to colonize. That adds to that, and then it's minus the rate at which patches are abandoned. And we have a number of terms here that we call parameters that just basically describe how this system works. And what's really cool is I had the data from all of my field work that I could get estimates for all of these numbers. And then once you have that and you have a model, you can do all sorts of playing around with the math and see how the system behaves if we change these things. So I couldn't go out there and throw a bunch of new beaver in the landscape, right? And I couldn't go out there and trap a bunch of beaver and remove them and wait 30, 40 years for the ponds to drain and stuff. So that's a limitation of field work, but we can use these mathematical models to begin to sort of play around and give us some hypotheses. And so this, you know, I gave that first stab at that is, well, what if we had a hypothetical landscape with no beaver and with lots of beaver? And so what this is a more sophisticated version. What happens with different amounts of habitat in the landscape? So what we're seeing is here is going from no forest to 100% forest, and the number of species we would estimate to see. And you can see that we see this nice hump-shaped curve, and sort of it's like Goldilocks, right? You get too many beaver here, and you have actually too many beavers over here with no forest, and too few beaver is over here, and both of those have fewer species than if you're right here in the middle where you have some beaver. And I was even able to say, well, you know, ethics prevent me from exterminating beaver in the system, but let's imagine what would happen if beaver went extinct. And there, what you can see, this is like from time 0, and the beaver begin to go extinct. Down here, this is just showing you the number of different patches. You can kind of ignore that. The top line is looking up here. This is the number of species in the system. And you can see that it stays pretty flat for about 150, 175 years, and then begins dropping down. And so that's really interesting because it says we could exterminate the beaver and then we would be waiting for over 100 years before we began to see the extinctions take place, just because of how long these systems basically persist. And that's an interesting point, both because it's sort of a nice thought experiment, but because in this part of the Adirondacks, beaver actually were extinct from this landscape for about 150 years. So they were heavily trapped early on and trapped out, and it was actually wealthy railroad magnates who brought beaver from Colorado because they wanted to have them swimming in the ponds where their summer retreats were up in the Adirondacks. So they were the early conservationists who brought beaver back. Around 1930 or 40 is when beaver came back to the Adirondacks. So I can't do that experiment today, but it was done. And we don't actually know whether any species went extinct, but this kind of analysis suggests that they could have held on for just that long. So that was kind of an interesting result to get from this modeling exercise that couldn't have gotten from field work alone. Okay, so what did we learn from this? First, that disturbance by beaver is really critical for maintaining species in this landscape. And one of the reasons for this is because beaver disturbance has a very large magnitude if we're talking about a type of disturbance. So I pointed out that this system has a really long lag time, right? That when you get a beaver meadow forming, it takes a long time for that to go back to being a forest. And that was a really interesting pattern, and I would have loved to have done some work with that. But I had gotten my PhD and had moved down to North Carolina and was having a conversation with a fellow scientist. He was finishing up his PhD at University of North Carolina. He's since moved up to Syracuse, and he was like, you know, my impression is that beaver around here in North Carolina, when they build a dam, it goes back to forest pretty quickly. And I was like, oh, that's interesting, because that's not how the world works in my view. And it just goes to show that you absorb unconsciously, and we have this tendency to generalize. Like we get a result in one place, and because we see that result, we sort of think, oh, well, that's the way the whole world works, right? And so I was just under the assumption that a beaver meadow stays a beaver meadow for 60, 70, 80 years and never goes back to forest. And he said, no, I don't think that's how it works here. And that got us thinking, well, I wonder if there's, if that's just a quirk, you know, maybe North Carolina beaver are weird, or New York beaver are weird, or maybe there's actually a pattern, a bigger scale pattern that we've been missing, right? And we were mulling that over for a while. And it turns out that studying beaver meadows is tricky. You know, there aren't that many beaver meadows in the landscape. Finding them is hard. But what's not hard is finding abandoned agricultural fields. And abandoned agricultural fields, it's basically the same process. You have a grassy area that turns back to forest, right? That's the same as a beaver meadow turning back to a forest. It's just you have a grassy system and then it becomes a forest. And the nice thing about that is now we're talking about succession, and succession in old fields is a thing that ecologists have been studying for a very long time, which brings me to my next story. Whoops. Sorry, skipped a whole bunch of there. Okay. Getting dizzy here, too much going on at once. Okay, there we go. Recovery rate. And now we're looking at woody dominance. And so what I'm showing you here is a picture on the left of, this is a field also up in New York, and it's dominated by these beautiful yellow goldenrods. And this is a place that was an agricultural field probably 10, 20 years ago, and it's still this pretty grassy open area. Versus here's a picture of a field in North Carolina that was abandoned only about 5 years ago, and you can see there's all these pine trees growing up here. And so this is work that I mentioned with Jason Fridley and former PhD student of mine, Aspen Reese. Dr. Reese is now at University of San Diego, and Dr. Fridley is at Syracuse University. And so we started with a question of beaver meadows, and then we said, well, I think that pattern is true with these abandoned agricultural fields or old fields as well. And so the first thing we did, because we weren't sure whether this was worth pursuing, is we went to the library. And we spent a lot of time in the library reading a lot of articles and trying to figure out, no one had really asked this question. That people have studied individual fields, but no one had really looked at that big scale. But we were able to pull together a whole bunch of studies. And so here's a map of the eastern United States here. And what I'm showing is the size of the dot is how long it took for that individual agricultural field after it was abandoned to reach 50% woody cover. So that's sort of, it's not a forest yet, but it's well on its way to becoming a forest. And if we look here, we can see, oh, look, down here in the south, those dots are pretty small. It doesn't take very long, right? And then up here in the north, the dots are pretty big. It takes a pretty long time. Maybe we're onto something. Maybe this is really a pattern. You can see that there's a lot of variability. So over here in Western Kentucky, you have two places right next to each other. One took 25 years and one of them only took 10 years. So, you know, there's a lot of variability, but there is this general pattern, and we can actually put that on a graph. And so here we've got degrees latitude on the x-axis. So here is down south at 30 degrees and up north at 45. And how long after abandonment these sites either reach 10% or 50% woody cover. And you can see that those relationships they're not bad. So if we talk about a regression, often we like to talk about the R-squared, the coefficient of correlation, which is just saying that we can explain about a third of the variation in how quickly it becomes covered in woody cover with degrees latitude. So it's definitely not explaining the whole story, but there's something there, right? And so why should succession be faster in the south? And there are a couple of things we came up with. 3 likely hypotheses. First, when you go south, it gets hot, right? So maybe it's temperature. And then we've got a couple of less obvious hypotheses about soils and then about plant traits. And so I'll walk you through each of those so we're all on the same page. So what is a temperature hypothesis? This actually comes in 2 different flavors. So the first is just biology happens faster when it's hotter. That's a general rule. Enzymes happen faster, metabolic rate happens faster. And so maybe the trees are just growing faster. And so what I'm showing here, this is a little sort of sketch. We've got time on here, canopy height, and this line here, this black line, you can think about that as how tall the grasses are in an area. And if you think about this process, we've got these little baby trees and they're growing in a grassy field. And at first they're at a real disadvantage, right? Because they're all shaded by that grass. And they're growing really slowly, really slowly, really slowly. And then eventually they get their leaves up above the grass. And all of a sudden they don't care. They can just take off and grow really fast. So it's really how long does it take for those trees to grow until they get above the grass canopy that's really important here. And so what we're showing here is that in the warmer environment, the red line, the slope is just steeper. They grow faster each year. And then in the winter, neither of them grow. And then in the second year, this plant growing in the red habitat has already gotten above the canopy. Whereas in the cold blue habitat, by the third year, it's still below the canopy. Okay, so that's one possibility. The other possibility is, well, maybe they don't grow faster in the south, they just grow longer. We have a nice long growing season. You guys in Tennessee too, we're keep expecting a nice storm, but spring is on its way, right? Whereas up in New York, they don't hope for spring until May, right? And so here we can see that the spring just happens sooner for these red ones. The slopes are the same, they're growing at the same rate, but because they have increased growth, increased period of time in the spring and in the fall, they just grow more each year, right? And so again, you don't have to grow faster, you can just grow longer and you can have the same result where after 2 years, the red plant makes it and the blue plant doesn't make it until the third year, okay? And this graph should be not surprising, it's warmer in the south. And it matches pretty well with our pattern here. Hotter areas tend to have faster growth. Okay, but I said there were a couple of other hypotheses to explore, and these ones will take a little bit more explanation. So one is soil fertility, and there's a lot going on here, but one, because I'm showing these data in a couple of ways, but when we think about the difference between grasses and trees, these graphs here are just showing the concentration of a bunch of different elements. So we've got magnesium, nitrogen, phosphorus, all on different axes, showing it all at the same time. But you can see that herbaceous plants here tend to have a lot more nutrients in them per gram of plant material. They need more potassium than oak forests do. They need more calcium, they need more nitrogen. So generally speaking, herbaceous plants, the grasses, are hungrier than the trees are. And you can see that another way we could look at that is the percent ash and dry matter. To get that, all we do is we take some plant material and we burn it, combust it at really high temperatures, and that burns off all the carbon, right? And what's left behind is the ash or the minerals that are not carbon. And you can see that the percent ash is a lot higher in grasses and sedges than in deciduous trees. Part of that is that trees have wood, and we know when we burn wood, that burns hot and leaves relatively little ash, but even the leaves themselves have less nutrients in them. Okay, so why does that matter? It matters because higher fertility soils tend to favor herbaceous species. Herbaceous species are hungry, right? And so if they have lots of nutrients in the soil, they grow really well. Whereas trees, they don't require as much, and so they can grow in lower nutrient places better than herbaceous stuff, the grassy stuff can. And so why does that matter when we're talking about a latitudinal gradient from north to south? So for here, we have to go back to this map. This is one of my favorite figures. So it was a paper that was written back in 1914. Okay, so we're doing a little bit of history here, and this is a great part of field work. This is a talk about field work, but you also do a lot of important work in the library. And so this was a paper. What you're seeing here is a state of Indiana, map of Indiana. And what this guy von Eglin did is he just went and compiled data on how much it cost to buy an acre of farmland in each of these counties. Okay. And you see this very interesting pattern in Indiana, where up north, it was pretty expensive to buy farmland, up to $125 an acre. And then there was this area down in the south where the farmland was literally dirt cheap. You could buy it for $10 or $25 an acre. Well, farmers aren't stupid. They're not going to pay a lot of money for land that you can't grow crops on, right? And the other thing to remember, 1914, this is before we had much in the way of fertilizer. So what we're seeing here by looking at the price of the land is we're looking at the fertility of the land. And so up north, we have highly fertile soils, and down south, we have really poor soils. And then you can kind of barely see on here, there's these lines here and here that sort of separate Indiana into the low soil fertility area in the southern and central region and the high soil fertility regions up north. And what those lines are showing are how far south glaciers went. And so glaciers, they came down during the Ice Age, right? Down right around southern Indiana is where they stopped. And so soils that had glaciers on them, the soil was ground up and it was revitalized. They're young soils and they're fertile and expensive. And then these areas down here that didn't have any glaciation, those are really poor soils. And so this is like showing how history from 12,000 years ago has a major impact on both the economics of today, the farm prices, and the ecological systems. So that's why I love this graph, because it's got it's like cool research techniques and also a really good way of displaying some information. So if we look, and it shows it much better than this graph actually, but this is the eastern US. What I'm showing here is soil fertility, and one of the ways we measure this is with cation exchange capacity. It's just a measure of how many minerals are in the soil, and it's generally quite low in the unglaciated areas in the south and gets pretty good in the northern areas. New England is kind of funny. It's because that's on granitic bedrock, so this measure of soil fertility doesn't work as well. But generally speaking, glaciated soils are rich, and herbaceous species do well in rich soils, and therefore that might be an area where the grasses are growing really well and the trees can't compete. Okay, so we put a lot of pieces together there to explain why it might be that trees don't grow as quickly in the north. So they like fertile soil, but they can't take advantage of that as much as the herbaceous stuff can. All right, one more set of hypotheses and species traits. And again, this is two things that we could see. It may not be temperature per se, it may be evolution for temperature that's driving this. So what we're showing here is how quickly saplings grow in a year and their bud freezing tolerance. And so southern species, these dots up here, they can grow quite quickly, up to 2 meters a year, and they can't tolerate bud freezing, okay? And whereas boreal species, these diamonds here, they grow really slowly, but they can tolerate up to minus 80 degrees Celsius. So their buds can get really cold, and then the next spring they grow. And part of the reason for that is that they produce antifreeze. Antifreeze, one of the major compounds of that is glycol, which is the sugar, which requires a lot of carbon. And basically, there's a trade-off going on here. These northern species are saying, I'm not going to use carbon to grow. I'm going to use carbon to produce antifreeze so I don't die. And I don't have as much carbon left over to grow, but at least I'm not dead. Whereas the southern species are like, yeah, I don't care. I don't need to protect myself. I'm going to grow like gangbusters, right? And so evolution has selected for faster growth in the south because they don't have to undergo this trade-off, right? So it may just be that southern tree species are inherently faster growing. It also might be true that the types of herbaceous species that we see that the trees are competing with are different. And I won't go into this too much, but we expect that the herbaceous species growing on rich soils would be more competitively dominant. Down here in the south, we tend to get this broom sedge andropogon, which leaves a lot of room around it where trees could potentially grow. Okay, so great. We've got all of these different hypotheses to explain this pattern, and we did a lot of work in the library, but eventually we're like, you know what, we need to get our hands dirty. Let's do an experiment to figure this out. Which of these is important? So this was a major feat of logistics. We set up a network of sites. I was the southern guy, so I got to drive down to Tallahassee and Athens, Georgia, a couple of times a year. So these are like 12-hour drives down I-95 and over to Tallahassee and then back up. And Jason was the northern guy, and he was able to make it all. So he was in Syracuse, and then we had a site over here around Albany and then down in New Jersey. But we've got this nice latitudinal gradient here. And so what we did is at each of those places, we created the same experiment. So we replicated our experiment. We usually talk about replication, right? Where if you're doing an experiment in the greenhouse, you want to have a bunch of pots under the same watering treatment, for example. But here, we not only replicated our experiment one place, we replicated it 6 different places because we wanted to see if the results of the experiment change when we go from a hot environment down in Tallahassee to a cold environment up in Syracuse. And then at each site, so that's our temperature gradient. We scratched our heads. We were like, could we manipulate temperature in place? And we just couldn't figure out a way to do that on a big enough scale to do it. So, but we needed to make sure that we were broke up our experiments, our factors up. So we had to create soils at each of the places that would mimic a northern soil and a southern soil. And the way we did that is we called up landscaping companies and had them bring big dump trucks of either topsoil and sand and mixed up on our own either very rich pure topsoil pots, or you'll see what our pots are, versus we would mix them with a lot of sand. And so a lot of sand mixed in with the topsoil means you've got low fertility places, low fertility treatment. So we made a gradient. So we had a gradient of fertility. And then we had the 4 tree species give us our tree traits, and we had northern species and southern species to give us our plant traits. So we've got temperature by going to different places. We've got soil fertility by making our different soil treatments. And then we've got plant traits as well. And so this is what it looks like. This is our southern site. Ecologists have to be really creative. And so what we did is we created little mini old fields out of plastic kiddie pools. And this was a funny story about this. Like, I had a lab technician who had sort of scoured the internet to find a supplier. So in each of these we had, I think it was 96 kiddie pools. So we had to have a lot of kiddie pools. We couldn't just drive down to your local Walmart and pick up whatever they had, because they would only have like 5 or 6 of them. So we had to find a wholesaler, and she worked really hard and had our order all lined up, and they were going to be shipped to all the places. And she was calling to check on them, and they were like, oh, actually, no, we can't supply you with your full order because Walmart just put in their annual order. And you might think you're ordering a lot, but they're the people we have to make happy. So you're just going to have to wait a few weeks longer. So that was frustrating, but and here it is. And so what you're seeing here in this first picture here is, so this is in the south, but this is a really sandy plot here, right? And we planted the same number of species and the exact same things in each of them, but you can see there's not much growing in there, right? And then back here, what we have is a pure topsoil plot. And you can see the vegetation there's a lot lusher. It's just a lot happier, right? And so what we're really interested in is, well, okay, so how are the tree seeds that we put in there? Are they growing? Are they germinating? And how quickly are they growing? And we let this experiment run for, I think, 2 years. So this was us first setting it up, and this is after 2 years. And we were pretty excited that we actually had what looked like real fields growing there. Yeah, and so here's what we found. In a nutshell, this is kind of a complicated graph. There's a lot going on here. But the most important thing here, this is the total seedling biomass. So we went to each one and we collected every tree seed we could find, every tree that had grown, we collected it and we weighed it. And this is just sort of the mean in each kiddie pool of how much woody biomass there was over time. And you can see, so here's our different sites, that the temperature at which those happen, so this is the Florida site here, that had a lot more biomass. So temperature seemed to increase the tree growth. Interestingly, so it increased the trees, but the herbaceous stuff it was competing against, this wasn't part of our hypothesis, actually grew worse in Florida. So the temperature had two effects. It made the trees grow better and it made the grasses grow worse. We put this into a really complicated model here where we've got trying to control all our variables all at once. But what you really want to focus on here is a couple of things. First, here's that temperature having a positive effect on seedling growth. And then the gray arrows are negative. So temperature had a negative effect on herbaceous mass. And herbaceous mass has a negative effect on light. So hotter temperatures mean less herbaceous, which means more light, which means more seedling growth. So this is like a win-win for the trees. They're like, ooh, it's hot, I can grow faster, and I don't have those annoying grasses that are shading me. When we look at the other things like soil moisture and nitrogen, there's a lot of arrows in here, but nothing really important. So it really did seem to be largely about temperature. Soils seem to have little effect on the total tree success. And so what we saw from all of this is that temperature seems to be the strongest driver of variation in rate of recovery. So that leaves a question, and we don't actually have the answer for this yet. We would need to do more experiments. In a warmer world, will fields turn into forests more quickly? So we see this pattern on the map, but that doesn't necessarily mean if we warm up in the north, things are going to go faster. All right, I see I am starting to run short on time, so I'm going to just tell you a bit of a story, but not go too much into the results here, because I think this is a fun place. This was work that I did with Dr. Rachel Mitchell, who's a professor at Northern Arizona, Dr. Greg Ames, who is working in industry, and my former PhD student, Dr. Ficken. And this is in that Sandhills region, just beautiful place to work. If you ever get a chance to wander through these landscapes, they're just gorgeous. It's like walking through a park, and lots of really high plant diversity. But what we were interested in here was this was taking place on an Army base, Fort Bragg, and the Army was required to set prescribed fire in here to maintain endangered species. And so that was something that they'd been doing since the late 90s. There's a bird, the red-cockaded woodpecker, that requires old growth longleaf pine. And if you don't burn these systems, the pine trees don't do as well. And as a result, the bird doesn't do as well. So the Army had been doing this and they thought they were doing great work. It was sort of a win-win. They could get credit for being good environmental stewards, and then it was also better for training conditions. And then they got a call from the EPA, the Clean Air Division, and say, hey, you know all those fires you're setting? They're putting lots of smoke in the air, and that's air pollution. And so they were like, wait, I thought we were being good environmental stewards by burning, and now you're telling us we're being bad. So they called a couple of scientists, including me, and said, hey, we need to figure out, like, if we change how frequently we burn, how will that affect the various components of the system? So there was a group of scientists working on air pollution. That wasn't me. I was working more on the plants. And after a lot of time, one of the things we were able to do was actually come up with a carbon budget. And so we had the Army. So this is just a picture of it. This is the Sandhills region. It used to be a really dominant ecosystem throughout the Southeast, and now it's pretty much restricted to this orange belt here. And we're working up here at the northern edge of it in North Carolina. And just a picture of it here. What we didn't know is, so there's two things that could go on. If you burn this system more frequently, every time you set a fire, you're sending carbon up into the air, right? So expectations, you burn more frequently, there's less carbon. But the more frequently you burn, also the better things grow, and they can grow back more rapidly. And as they grow, that's pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. And so there's this trade-off with fire frequency. And we didn't know if we burn more frequently, are we going to see more carbon in the system or less carbon in the system? And because we're working with the Army, they said, yeah, we'll burn it however you want. And so we were able to have an experimental design where we got 4 different fire treatments at great big scale. So whole watersheds that they would burn annually, they would burn every 2 years, 3 years, or not burn at all. And we sampled plots along a gradient, not too important, but because we sort of mix all those together to figure out our carbon budget. So we had a lot of time since fire. And the first, actually, I'm just going to skip. So here's for the field work, we had to do a lot of work here. There's all sorts of places where there's carbon in the system. So it's in the trees. So we measured how much the trees grew. It's in the litter on the floor of the forest. So we measured how much litter was there. That's not like trash, that's like pine needles and stuff. We measured how much soil was in the roots and in the carbon. And then we also measured how much new carbon was coming into the vegetation, how much litter was falling from the pine trees to the floor, and how much the roots were growing. So we measured a lot of stuff. This is one of those things with field work. Like this is like 4 years of summers of intense work, and we boil it all down into one single graph, right? It's like, how could that much work just tell so little? But there's a lot in there. So here's the take-home point. This is the total carbon. So that across all of those pools, how much carbon is in the trees, how much is in the pine needles, how much is in the soil, how much is in the roots, and given how many times that site burned. So over here, these 1 site times, those were basically the suppression. They burned at the beginning of the system, at the experiment, and they didn't burn at all after that. And then these 5-year plots, they burned every year. And what you see is if you keep fire out of the system, it definitely looks like they're storing more carbon overall. And then if you start burning them, you're basically losing carbon from the system. So what that tells us is that increased fire frequency leads to lower overall carbon storage. So that might say, okay, we want to keep fire out, but I told you that the fire is really important for diversity. And so I think this actually sets up a really challenging question for us of, how do we balance these different demands? If we're using disturbance as a tool in these systems, if we burn too frequently, we lose carbon from the system, and that's putting it in the atmosphere, potentially contributing to climate change. But if we exclude fire to maximize carbon storage, we're going to lose some endangered species. And so it sets up a bit of a dilemma. And I think that's a place where science, me as a scientist, what I can do is I can tell you the consequences of policies, and then it's we as society have to decide, okay, here are the numbers, how do we value this? And so I think this is a place where like field work has a lot of nitty-gritty challenging work, and in the end, it's just one step in the process. Like you can do the field work and it leads to modeling questions, or you can do the field work and it leads to political questions. But if you don't do the field work, you don't have the important materials necessary for all of those future directions. So I think, yeah, good, finished up at a good time, and just leave you with these 2 pictures, and I'm very happy to take any questions at all.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wright. And at this point, I would encourage you to, anybody that has something, a comment you'd like to make, or a discussion point or a question, to unmute your mic and ask a question.
So, Dr. Wright, it sounds like you dealt with fire quite a bit, and I'm just curious, were there ever any like dicey moments? Or I know there were probably professionals, but just curious to hear if you have any funny stories or anything crazy.
Yeah, no, the biggest risk on Fort Bragg, I didn't get to go out with a fire crews. They wouldn't let me. I was bummed about that. My PhD student, Dr. Ficken, before she was working with me, she worked down at a place in Florida called Archibald Field Station. And there's a great picture of her she was on the fire crew and she had like a drip torch and was burning. And so she was a hardcore person. I never got to set the fires. No, the biggest risk there was actually driving on the roads and getting stuck in the mud, which is not glamorous, but boy, is it a pain in the butt.
Yeah, no, I know from experience.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, I'll go off of John's question. In all of the years and places that you have accomplished field work, have you ever had any dangerous or sort of scary situations with animals or wildlife?
Yes. A couple. So they were, one didn't happen but could have. I did work for a while in Glacier National Park, and there the disturbance I was looking at were grizzly bears, who go up in the meadows up above tree line. And if you ever looked at a grizzly bear up close, hopefully not a live one, you'll notice that they both have huge claws and that big hump on their back is all muscle. And they're actually digging machines. And so when they go up there, they basically will pull the sod up, and they go and they're going for basically bulbs like you plant in your garden, and they'll dig them up and they'll just eat all the bulbs. And so whenever I was doing work up there, you were never supposed to do work on your own, because if you're looking down on the ground, a grizzly bear can just pop up out of nowhere. So you always had to have one person who was like watching point and the other person who had their head down. I saw grizzly bears, but from a safe distance, so never too much of a worry there. The scariest animal encounter I ever had was when I was doing fieldwork in Venezuela, and there I was studying fish in streams. And it was, we think of streams, you think, oh, there's, 5 or 6 species of fish. This stream had over 150 species of fish in it. This is what the tropics do for you, just incredible fish diversity. And so I would be in these pools and had a mask and a snorkel on. And the way that I would start at the downstream end of this pool and sort of look around, and I actually had like a, I can't even remember what it was, but I had some way of writing underwater, which was kind of cool. And so I'd write down, okay, I see 10 of this species and 3 of this species and 2 of that species. And you would have to repeat that count 3 times as you did it. And then I would sort of, this wasn't a deep pool, it was only 3 feet or so. So I'd sort of pull forward on the bottom and go to the next spot. And I was in this one pool that I'd been in, 3, 4, 5 times before, and it always gave me kind of a hinky feeling. I didn't like it, but I never really knew why. And I was at the first site and I did my first sweep, and I'm like, that's interesting. There's a little branch sticking out of the bottom, like right in front of my face. And I didn't think much of it. And I did a second one, and it's there, and it was sort of registering in my lizard brain that shouldn't be there. I did the third one, and as I was looking at it, the shape sort of manifested around it. It was a freshwater stingray, and I could have pulled, if I would have like gone right over it and would have pulled a Steve Irwin, the crocodile hunter, and gotten that stingray right in my face or in my chest. But I very fortunately saw that it was a stingray, and I told my advisor, I'm not sampling that pool again. He's like, we need the data. I'm like, you need to find someone else to do there, because I'm not swimming in that pool. So that was the most scared I've ever been with animals. Yeah. But mostly it's been a blast, and just go to beautiful places. That's I would certainly emphasize the beauty and the joy more than the hot, sweaty. It's usually annoying things like poison ivy and tick bites and mosquito bites, much more than like the really scary stuff that gets to you. But
I know we only have another minute or so, but I was just, something had occurred to me. I'm envisioning the difficulty of filling 96 kiddie swimming pools with clay and sand and soil. Did you have the same people that would help you, the same team, I guess, that would help you at each site that you went to, or was it different?
yeah, it was that's one of the big challenge. Like the single biggest, like if I looked at all the grants I've gotten over time and said, like, what has cost me the most money? It's definitely people, like, because there's a lot of hard labor involved. So yeah, we were wheeling wheelbarrows, and it was mostly a team of about 4 people, one of whom was sort of my longtime lab manager. Other people were people I just sort of hired short term to help me out with that. But we did have some fun road trips. This was, you know, COVID makes you miss road trips, and it was fun going with all 4 or 5 of us. We played a lot of music, and we're really sore by the end of the day, but felt like we'd really accomplished something. But yeah, it was hard work.
All right. Well, at this point, I want to thank you, Dr. Wright, for taking time to speak with us and tell us about your adventures. I mean, it's hard to imagine competing with Walmart for swimming pools, dodging stingrays, and looking on the lookout for grizzlies. So it certainly sounds like field work can be a lot of fun and a lot of adventure. Before we go, I do want to thank Lainey and John for all the hard work they've done to make this process and this event happen. And additionally, I'd like to put in a bit of a plug. I'd like to ask you all to invite your friends and register for next week's seminar, where we're going to have a presentation by Dr. Marielle Postova Davignon from Virginia Wesleyan University, whose presentation will be Adventures of a Termite Ecologist, Learning to Make the Most Out of What Nature Gives You. And join us and see what she has to tell us and what adventures she has to share. So in the meantime, invite a friend, register for the next talk, and check us out at Lincoln Memorial University and the School of Mathematics and Sciences on Facebook and Instagram. Thank you all. Go have some adventures, and we'll see you next week.